data is so fundamental to making good decisions. And if your data isn't set up the right way, it's going to lead down the path of being a liability, not an asset. So I think it's so critical to ensure that you have that foundation, which is your data, in place so you can make those strategic decisions and so you can align sales and revenue with marketing and with product and so on. So the whole business can be aligned.
You're listening to ROAPS Champions, a podcast created for B2B leaders to help you align your people, streamline your processes, trust your data, and leverage technology in order to grow your business. We're your hosts, Brendan Deneville, CEO and co-founder of Dynamico,
and Amy Weaver, Dynamico's marketing director. Channing, it's great to meet you. This is my first opportunity to speak with you and do an interview, but you're a repeat guest of ours on the podcast, which is really exciting.
Yes, exactly. Excited to be back.
I want to make sure our listeners go back and hear your previous episode too, if they haven't yet. So I would encourage them to do that.
Yeah, Channing, it's great to see you again.
Yes, you as well, Brendan.
You two on the previous episode talked about the rowing the boat analogy, aligning to achieve a common objective, which was really cool. And also a lot of the components of HubSpot's sales operations strategy. So compensation for reps, how you do territories, planning for headcount, that sort of thing. So now you've moved on to a new company and you're in a similar role, different title. So maybe you could tell us how your responsibilities have changed as you made that transition.
Sure, yeah. I left HubSpot to step into a CRO role. And where I am now, actually, I'm in the process of transitioning, to be candid. So I just did leave SEMrush, but I was the chief sales officer at SEMrush and just left actually about a week ago. So the role is interesting, though, as a chief revenue officer, chief sales officer versus the role I had at HubSpot, which was head of sales strategy. There wasn't, and there isn't that much of a difference, actually, when it kind of comes down to it. The day-to-day of figuring out how to operationalize the sales team is a really big part of any CRO or chief sales officer role. And just like it was a big part of my role back at HubSpot. The slight difference is I get a little more customer engagement. I get a little bit more face time with the customers in a chief revenue, chief sales officer role than I would or did back at HubSpot. That's probably the biggest difference in the two roles.
Okay.
Channing, do you have a preference of the more customer-facing role versus the more sort of internal operations-based role?
Yeah, I was just chatting with someone actually about this yesterday, and I like both. It's one of these things that is probably a strength and weakness of mine, whereas I like variety, and variety can be good and bad. When you have too much variety, it can spread you a little too thin.
I hear you.
But I really do enjoy the strategy, the operations, the building process side of sales. At the same time, you can't do that properly without talking to customers, I think. So I think it's so important to be able to make the right strategic decisions, to be able to get in front of customers and have those customer conversations. So you have to find a blend and a balance, I think, to be able to do the strategy piece well. There's some great sales leaders that are exceptional at customer engagement, and that's where they focus their time. And that's okay. That's not me. As much as I love customer engagement, I like the blend. I like the balance. And I think that's really important.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. I can see how some people might tend towards one or the other, but I could see sort of the power of being able to do both being a really good thing.
So shall we dive into these questions that we talked about kind of leading up to the interview? We've been hearing from a lot of our guests that their data or tech stack technology that they're using could be a huge asset to the team or a liability, just depending on how they're kind of optimizing those. So how would you manage those types of things on a team of yours to make sure you're on the asset side?
Yeah, I think this is a great topic, actually. Data is so fundamental to making good decisions. And if your data isn't set up the right way, it's going to lead down the path of being a liability, not an asset. So I think it's so critical to ensure that you have that foundation, which is your data, in place so you can make those strategic decisions and so you can align sales and revenue with marketing and with product and so on. So the whole business can be aligned. Again, referencing back to our rowing the boat all in the same direction.
Exactly.
On the prior podcast. So it's interesting because it can be a liability, though, when data isn't set up properly and when data leads to slow decision making or bad decision making. then it becomes a true liability, actually. And I've seen that happen. I've seen it play out. And it's challenging when you're in that sort of a spot where you can't come to conclusions, or your conclusions are inaccurate, maybe based off of the wrong data. So I think it's a really important part of any revenue leader role, be it RevOps or a sales leadership role, to ensure that you have that foundation in place, and then your data becomes a true asset. Because once you have data set up properly, and when I say set up properly, it's as simple as making sure systems are talking together. It's to ensure that when you pull and ask for a certain data set, you know what you're getting. It's not three different answers to the same question, which can sometimes happen. So it's just very simple things like that. Like, what's my conversion rate from op to closed won, or from lead to op creation? And you have to make sure, again, those sort of questions can get answered very clearly. And when they are, then you can start gaining insight and foresight into the business. And this is a concept that I'm a big fan of. I think for RevOps professionals, it's the idea of the ops team's job is to give you hindsight, give you reporting, but it's also their job, along with sales leadership, to create insight and foresight. And if you have that foundation of data in place, then you can begin to create that foresight. And the foresight is predictability, driving predictability into the business. And that's what any good sales leader and revenue leader wants, is predictability. But again, it doesn't happen without good data, that foundation.
Channing, so this might be, a little bit of a question of how long is a piece of string? But in your experience, when data has become a liability, do you have a feel for how long it might take to turn that around so that it becomes an asset?
Depends how big of a liability it is. It can be simple sometimes. It can be very complex other times. There's a company who I was speaking to recently, do a lot of advisory type work, and they have 7 different instances of Salesforce. So trying to synchronize data across those 7 instances is extremely difficult. When I was even at SEMrush, we had multiple instances of CRM. We had HubSpot and Salesforce in place, and synchronization of data was extremely difficult as well. So it depends is the really short answer. And everyone hates the response, it depends, but that's the reality of it. Because it can be simple. It could be as simple as, we just need to make sure our data tables that we're using are clear in terms of actually giving namings of the columns in the data tables. I'll get kind of very technical for a minute. So if you kind of have a SQL database, you want to make sure the database is labeled properly. So when someone says, I want to look at the opportunity to close one conversion rate, it's very easy to pull that data. And I'm simplifying this a little bit here. And sometimes it's just clarifying the data labels. There might be 2 different data labels that are called that. And let's make sure it's very clear, this is the one data label that we want. That could be as simple as Salesforce or HubSpot custom object labeling, cleaning that up. Other times, it's as complex as 7 different instances of your CRM. So, depending on the level of complexity, really dictates how long it can take to create that strong foundation.
Yeah. And then, Channing, you said something else as you started Amy's previous question around maintaining your data as an asset versus it becoming a liability. And you talked about systems talking to each other. This is where, so as we talked about in the last episode where you and I were together, we talked about the typical RevOps structure of people, process, data, and technology or systems. So you kind of introduced, again, the reliability on how data and systems are connected. Because if your systems are not connected, it's highly unlikely, or it's a lot more difficult to keep your data as an asset. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. And there's always lots of systems in today's kind of tech stack day and age. There's the best of breed approach to systems. And I think as companies grow, they typically go down that path of looking for best of breed. And when you do that, you end up with multiple systems. Now, fortunately, a lot of these service providers are aware of that, and they have pre-built integrations in place. But if you stack on one system on top of another, you want the bottom system to be able to talk to the top system. And that can be really challenging, kind of navigating through that stack of systems, if you will. And that's where you have to make sure you've got the right system setup and configuration to be able to have the full integration. You can have one-to-one integration, and one-to-one is a little easier than, again, 10 different systems maybe kind of talking to one another.
In HubSpot land, we still talk about, the single source of truth. And I think as you've now worked at a few other, organizations and you're advising other companies that might be larger in size than what HubSpot typically deals with. So companies that are 5,000, 10,000 people plus, the complexity of the tech stack and the data and the single source of truth. Do you see companies that are, let's say, 10,000, 20,000 people Are they still achieving that single source of truth, or is it really difficult at that stage?
So I think what I've found is companies that are getting to that stage, 10,000, 20,000 employees, they often get there through inorganic growth just as much as through organic growth. And inorganic means through acquisition. So when they're going through the process of acquiring other companies, they have multiple systems that they're acquiring as well. And one of the things that companies often will overlook is the complexity of technical integration during an acquisition. And I think that leads down this path of 7 CRMs or other things like that. It's the synergies, the process is all looked at very closely to say, can our sales team have synergies? Can our products, can we position the products the same ways? The idea of having these back end systems being a little different is kind of like brushed aside sometimes or not looked at as closely. And that's where the challenges often come from, is that kind of inorganic growth through acquisition and then all these multiple systems and then trying to untangle them or have them somehow weave together is not easy. So it's not to say that companies shouldn't grow through inorganic growth or through acquisition. They should, but you have to be very thoughtful of that aspect, the technical aspect of those acquisitions.
Which, of course, we see even in the sort of the HubSpot ecosystem, which are typically companies that are 2,000 people and fewer. So somewhere between, our sweet spot is somewhere between 100 and 2,000 people companies. And even there's a lot of M&A activity. There has been in the last couple of years, and they seem to be continuing. And every time it happens, even if you have two companies that are on HubSpot integrating, you have to manage that. But it's, of course, a little more complicated when one has Salesforce, one has HubSpot, or you start we're seeing more of the 3, 4, 5 companies that are integrating to create a platform, and 2 on one system and 3 on another. It gets really complex really quickly, right?
Yeah, exactly. And even HubSpot, which I think is one of the simpler CRMs out there, and obviously I'm a big fan of HubSpot after working there. However, custom objects can create complexity. So if you have 2 different instances of HubSpot, you have different custom objects sitting within those 2 instances, and then how do you get those systems to talk together? It's doable, but it's something that you need to be aware of.
Right. And of course, we like to say it's a lot more doable if you have a RevOps model in place. So Amy, I'll let you, I've taken us off track a little bit here, so I'll let you bring us back.
No, that's fine. We've been talking a lot about technology, so that's a good lead in to our next sort of set of questions. So there obviously are a lot of factors that would go into deciding to get a new technology to incorporate something new. So I'm curious of how you might go about that, and then the process for making sure that the adoption is easier and everyone gets ramped up and is on board together to start using it.
The first question we always look at when thinking about new systems and new technology is, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? And so we need to make sure we're very clear on that problem, because sometimes it's easy to get enamored with the flashy thing that sits out there, and maybe it doesn't actually solve the problem that you have. So for example, let's just create one on the fly here. AI is all exciting and everyone loves the idea. I have to have AI in my sales process. I have to have AI in this. Is that really solving a problem for you today? If it is, great. But don't just go out and buy a solution that has AI built into it just because it's the hot topic that everyone talks about these days. Make sure you have very clear problems, prioritization of those problems, and then think about solving them. The other thing to think about is time to implement. And I think this is another really big one. When you think about getting a new system and putting that in place, what's better? Is it better to buy a new system or to reconfigure the system you have, to build something internally? There are multiple options usually. You should look at each one of those options closely. The idea of buying something brand new, yes, it gives you a fresh starting point and you can kind of have this clean slate on the system, but it could take a long time to implement, train, all those factors. Reconfiguring what you have may end up being the better option, actually. And not to say it always is, but I think you really have to look closely at that. The buy versus build discussion is always one. If you have a big enough tech team, they might lean down the path of building something. I personally try to lean away from building. I think unless if you are a company that has a strong internal tech team that does a lot of this work yourself, then great. But lean on companies that know how to do this, where the expertise lies. And usually that's an external vendor or third party of some sort. So I tend to, again, lean away from it, even though in plenty of scenarios I've seen internal tech teams want to do the build because they get excited about the idea of building something on their own. I'd prefer to buy. Again, going back to this idea of reconfigure what you have versus buy new. And I think that's a really important discussion and decision to make, because reconfiguring can work. And it usually is it could be, it depends on the scenario, but it could be a safer bet where you already know what you have and the known is better than the unknown. Because when you buy something brand new, there are going to be unknown challenges in that brand new thing. So again, I would really weigh both of those things, and I've made both decisions. I think back at SEMrush, for example, we opted to, and don't shoot me for this one, we opted to stay with Salesforce. As much as we all wanted to go down the HubSpot path at the time, it wasn't the right time for us. And we had a lot of buy-in, but reconfiguring Salesforce ended up being the choice that we wanted to make in a window of time. Now, that doesn't mean indefinitely. That's in a window of time. That was the right choice. But also there's times where we said we need a whole new legal document management tool. And the one we had just wasn't working well for us. So we did go out and buy something new. So again, we've made both of those decisions. And I look back at HubSpot days as well. We've made the same decision, but we had to look at all three options: buy, build, or reconfigure.
Yeah, it was funny. Dharmesh posted something on LinkedIn yesterday that he just arrived in San Francisco, and he was driving to his hotel from the airport, and he was seeing all these billboards, and he says something along the lines, it's one of the few cities where all the billboards are owned essentially, or the ads are all by SaaS companies. And he recalls he and Halligan so many times discussed, do we do billboards? And of course, HubSpot never did billboards. And I think it brings me to where you were going, the strategic planning aspect of all these kinds of decisions, right? And I actually commented on Dharmesh saying, because I learned this from Halligan like 8 or 9 years ago, strategy is as much about knowing what not to do than it is what knowing to do, right? And I think they would even agree with your decision at SEMrush that strategically it made sense to stick with what you had. But bringing it back to where you started around the sort of business problem or the business objective, this is something that we are finding a lot of success with currently with clients and prospects and new clients. And that is sort of taking a 3-year approach. So this is what we have today. These are the systems. This is the data situation we have. These are the processes. These are the teams, et cetera. That's the current state. What does the ideal future state look like? And then being realistic about how long that's going to take. And we believe that a 3-year roadmap is still pretty realistic, because a lot of these things, especially, as we go further and further up market, there's only so much you can do in a year, right? So then what do you then push to year 2, and what would then potentially be pushed to year 3? And that you might only really have a better idea of in year 2, but it comes down to what are the priorities for year 1, and then what are the priorities for the next 90 days. So I love the way you position that by, let's start with the business problem or the business objective, and then kind of plan from there. And then you iterate every 90 days. And the reality is that you're far more likely to get to the goal over the 3 years than you would have been if you hadn't done that.
Would this be a good opportunity for us to listen to a few stories of lessons learned throughout your career, sometimes where you made mistakes, either with regard to implementing technology or from a data perspective, and how you came out of those stronger and with lessons learned?
Definitely. So shall we start with technical lessons learned, and we can get into process, because there's lots of lessons learned in my career. So when I stepped into SEMrush, I realized our data was a little messy. And it's one of these things that I think I tried to make decisions based off the data before I fixed the data. And I really should have spent more time fixing the data and getting it really right, and making sure we had a good understanding of how to leverage that data properly. So it elongated some of our decision making. And we knew that we didn't have easy access to the data. We knew we had to do custom SQL queries to pull information. So my ops team was spending hours and hours building custom SQL for every request that we had, as opposed to having a very simple structured data set that we could pull simple queries out of. This wasn't complex ask, the types of questions that I had, but we just didn't have a good data structure. Therefore, you had to do custom queries. And I think this is where it's really important for a revenue leader to understand enough of the ops to be able to help the ops team make those sorts of decisions. So as I dug in, I began to realize why these requests were taking so long is because it was custom SQL that we were doing. And when I wanted to know, again, just a simple conversion rate, there wasn't a way for me to simply look, or even the ops team to simply look at that. So I think my lesson learned coming out of this is, number one, dig deep with ops. When they're taking a long time to answer questions and things that seem simple, there's a reason for that. It's not because the ops team is inadequate usually. It's because the system that they're using and the process that they're using can be a little bit inadequate. It's also, I think, empower your ops team to speak up and say, here's a problem that we're having. We need to solve this to be able to keep up with the business. Because if the ops team is going too slow and the business is going a lot faster, then we've got a disconnect. So that was probably the other lesson learned is, number one, again, obviously help them to solve the problem. But number two, really empower that ops team to say what they need and be very clear about what they need. So that was kind of very foundational, I would say, in terms of systems. There's another lesson learned here across a couple different scenarios. And I won't get into companies specifically this one. I'll talk a little higher level because I've seen it a couple times.
Sure.
But it's overbuying of software. And
tech bloat.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Having a little bit of bloat. So you can very quickly and easily get enamored with the shiny object. And when you're not solving the core problem, then you're overspending on a variety of software. And I've seen this in, again, multiple cases. So I think it's really important to get back to that core problem, which we were talking about earlier. What's the problem that we're trying to solve? What's that core problem that we're trying to solve? And then make sure we've got the right software and systems. And it's not volume of systems. It's more, we might only need one tool that can solve 80% of that problem. But let's make sure that tool is really good at solving 80% of that problem. It's very often very hard to solve 100% of the problems that you have. And if you do, you're spending a lot on technology probably to get there. And again, it creates a lot of confusion for the rep. Should I use this system or that system or this tool or that tool? So if you can really deeply solve 80% of a problem, then you're often in a better spot than trying to lightly solve 100% of a problem. And again, that comes back to just having one or two really good systems and investing heavily into those small handful of systems.
And eliminate that complexity that might come after.
Exactly, because complexity creates its own problems in and of itself. Another one, I'm kind of getting out of technology now, more into process, is the importance of a strong sales process. And I've seen this, I saw this at HubSpot, I saw this at SEMrush, I saw this in my early days, even back at Capital IQ. It's just creating that repeatable process. And the reason this is so important is when you don't have that, your ramp time is extremely long for the reps. And there's two ways, I think, of looking at rep ramp time. There's how long does it take for them to technically ramp? We're going to give them a 6-month ramp, a 3-month ramp. What does that look like? And then there's also how long does it take to get to a plateau of productivity? And I looked closely at this back at HubSpot. The ramp time we would give to reps would be roughly about 6 months. And that was very generous, and they typically would do fairly well during that ramp period. But there was a plateau that they would hit at about 18 months. And it was really important that they would overachieve once they got to that plateau. So yes, they would ramp in 6 months, but then there's this other gradual ramp that would happen thereafter for another roughly 12 months. And then they would hit a real plateau. So there's almost 2 ramps that were going on. And understanding that second ramp took a while to figure out. But then I realized we were missing out on opportunity. The reality was it was an 18-month ramp to get to a plateau of productivity. We were assuming 6 months we were getting to the plateau, but we weren't actually. So we should find ways to pull that down from 18 months down to 12 months to 9 months. There's something else people are doing at 18 months. There's something that's clicking kind of once they get there. And how do we pull that forward to say, actually, let's get you to that plateau in 6 months, not 18 months. So I think that was a really interesting learning for me at HubSpot, was to say there's often and I've seen this in multiple cases now, there's often 2 ramps. There's the ramp to somewhat sustainable productivity, and then there's a ramp to highly productive reps. And bringing those two things closer together adds so much value into the business, because you really want to have everyone at that highly productive level
quicker.
Exactly. So
nice.
Yeah, those are a few learnings. Let me add one more learning on. And the last one is culture, the importance of culture. And what culture means to everyone is different. I've made a few moves in my career. And whenever I've made a move, usually there's a culture element tied into the why. So joining HubSpot, I loved HubSpot. And I didn't leave because of culture. But when I left the company a while back, a company called C2FO, I left there because of culture. And it wasn't the right culture for me. But culture means something different for everyone. And it's not to say it's the wrong culture for everyone. But for me and for my values and for how I see a good company getting built, I didn't think it was the right culture for me. So when I look at S&P Capital IQ, again, early days, Capital IQ had a great culture. We were highly collaborative culture. Everyone's doing a little bit of everything, but that's not the right culture for everyone. Some people really like silos and they want to have more focus. Whereas again, at Capital IQ, we're a little different. When I stepped into S&P, they acquired us. We merged into a slightly different culture. It wasn't the right culture for me. So time to leave. So again, I think it's so important to understand the idea of good culture, but the more important thing is what's a good culture for you or for me? And then applying that to each company as you look at the company, because it could work well for someone else, but it might not work for me.
Well, it's interesting that you bring this up too. We had another conversation with an old colleague of mine who is in sales, and we were talking about how culture can be greatly affected by headcount. Like as you're ramping up and you're scaling all of your teams, those new individuals are leaving their mark, so to speak, on the culture. So could you speak a little bit to that about companies that are in these high growth phases and how to sort of maintain that culture if it is the one that's a fit for everyone as you're getting bigger?
Yeah, I think there's a great book called Tribes. And what it talks about is how culture is created. And the thesis around it is tribes of people. But tribes exist in groupings of about 200. So as your company goes above 200, you begin to create multiple tribes within a company. And that evolves the culture actually as you have these different tribes. And they did a whole analysis on this, why it's 200, but it's kind of a directional number. But I think it's a really interesting way to think about things is as you hit different thresholds and plateaus, you're going to have multiple cultures within the business. And then those cultures kind of come together because they're all a big blob of one culture, but they're evolving as you can imagine, the kind of different blobs attaching onto the central blob. And interesting way to think about it.
Yeah.
So culture evolves, though, is the important thing. And as you hire more and more people, that they will dictate and evolve the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And the people are what create culture. It's leadership can drive the culture in a certain direction, but they aren't going to always dictate the whole culture. So they can kind of give some direction to it. You can build your values and things like that to hire people that align with that cultural design that you're trying to create. But again, it will ebb and flow as you bring more people on. And that's something that you have to be aware of, but also you need to hire to that culture. I think there's a concept that often people talk about, it's he or she is a great cultural fit. I'm often careful of that because I think if you say cultural fit, you're trying to then fit everyone into a box. And that's not reality. Is you want additive to a culture. You want to bring people that are not just a fit, but additive to the culture. So I kind of look beyond saying it's a fit, saying, oh, they're a nice add into our culture, additive to our culture, which implies, again, we know the culture is going to grow and evolve because you can't contain it. It has to grow as the company's size grows.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's all really good stuff. Channing, I wanted to kind of go back to just one thing that I was curious about that I know a lot of our audience might be curious about, specifically our audience that are not SaaS companies. So we work with fewer and fewer SaaS companies as we're sort of focusing more and more on our ICP. The sort of industries and verticals outside of SaaS don't have the ops structure that is very common in SaaS companies, especially mid to larger SaaS companies. So a lot of these companies I'm talking about, they don't have an ops team. They don't have marketing ops. They don't have sales ops. They don't have service ops. They don't have rev ops, although that's a conversation for another time potentially. But what are the functions of an ops team, as you were talking about that earlier, that businesses that aren't structured in that way, how do they essentially create the ops function, even if they call it something different?
Fundamentally, I think ops is a mix of really probably four things. And I think it's data is a piece of ops. So that's, again, I think the fundamentals to ops. So you have to make sure you have your data and being captured in the right way. And that can be as simple as you need a person who's thinking about data capture in the CRM. It doesn't have to be overly complex. Or it can be much more complex where someone who has a PhD in data engineering and can manage multiple databases and data structures. Again, it can be any one of those things. But either way, you have a mechanism for capturing and managing data at the base level. So that's one piece of ops. Then the next piece of ops is process. And it's helping to figure out what are the processes we need to optimize how we do things internally. And again, I think of it through the go-to-market lens. Ops can extend beyond that even, but you have to figure out those processes to create efficiency. And that's what ops' job is, to help drive efficiency. That could be sales process. It could be system process. It could be customer engagement, follow-on process, customer support process. All those things are processes. So processes is kind of the second piece to it. The third piece is strategy, helping develop the strategy. And the strategy ultimately sits with the go-to-market leader, but you need assistance in developing that strategy. So that assistance is often derived from process, derived from analysis, derived from insights, across the customer base and so on. And this is where it's a mix of ops and go-to-market leadership, usually figuring out the strategy. But I personally find that often strategy is overlooked in ops. And I think it's a really important part of ops. And as I think, even if you have one individual on your ops team, you don't need to have a huge team. When I kind of talk to a lot of smaller companies, that's all they have is one. I say, make sure you're hiring for that person who can help assist with strategy. So yes, we want to make sure that data is a piece of it and process is a piece of it, but strategy is also a piece. And then the fourth leg to our stool here is enablement. And I think this is one you can grow into. So depending on the size of the business, I do think dedicated enablement is really important. And I see that sitting in and around ops. When I think of ops, I think of enablement. Sometimes there's an argument to have enablement report directly into the head of sales. I think that's okay. But again, when I think of the collective ops function, I think of enablement as a part of that, because enablement's job is to help ensure these efficient processes, these strategies that we've determined are getting followed and getting deployed. And you can create a great strategy, but if no one's following it and no one understands it, then it's not really all that good. You can create a great process, but if no one's actually following that process. So that's where enablement comes in. They're kind of connecting the dots between what you're developing and what people are actually doing kind of on the floor, the sales team is actually executing on. Mm-hmm. So those are the four components of it. I think one person can do three of those four actually just fine. If you're a small business, you can have a person who thinks about data, thinks about process, and thinks about strategy. And there's people out there, who can do that. I think enablement usually is a separate skill set. And in some cases, you don't have enablement. That's okay. But then your managers need to be doing enablement and need to be the owners of enablement. Preferably, though, I think it's a dedicated enablement is a worthwhile investment.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Thank you. It actually came to the fore a couple of weeks ago because, again, when you're dealing with a larger professional services consulting company, which is one of the areas where we're strong, or franchises, or even some large nonprofits, and of course manufacturing companies, when you start talking about ops or operations, for example, we were talking about HubSpot's Operations Hub or Ops Hub, and they were like, "Oh no, we don't need to use HubSpot for our backend." They were thinking that ops was actually the operations of their manufacturing or professional services or whatever. They're not thinking of it in the terms of the revenue team, which of course is how HubSpot thinks about it, because it's, again, that's how you think about it in SaaS world. But that's really helpful.
Yeah, no, and I think, Brendan, you raise a great point that the word operations in the SaaS world is something that's new-ish, let's say in the past, 15 years or so, 20 years even. But in the manufacturing world, operations has been around as long as manufacturing has been around. It's how does the system work? And the system is a machine often. You kind of go back to the olden days, it's literally just let's have this kind of cog and this wheel work. It's really basic. So in the SaaS world, we took from manufacturing, we took the idea of operations is that let's make sure we've got cogs that work together, and let's have people are the cogs. So those people are creating these cogs, but we're using the same word. So I imagine often words can get confusing when you're talking cross industry. So it's a great point to highlight what SaaS operations kind of means. And by the way, it doesn't fit just for SaaS, though. I think these same concepts of quote unquote RevOps apply across all businesses and are actually critical across all businesses nowadays.
Thanks again so much for joining us and being our first return guest on RevOps Champions. Could you leave our listeners and those who watch it on YouTube with one or two pieces of advice as you head out?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'll probably just tie it back to the discussion that we've had so far today, because there's always tons of topics we can talk about around advice. But I think a few things that just stuck in my head from our conversation. I think where we started was great around the fundamentals of data and understanding how to make data an asset, not a liability. But the reality is data can be a liability. And I think that's kind of the first piece of advice I might say is recognize when your data is a liability versus an asset, and make sure to really dig in and understand that, because data is so fundamental into everything that you do, every strategic decision that you make. Ultimately, the foresight that you have into the business as a revenue leader stems from data. So if data is a liability, it's going to make those decisions harder. It's going to lead down the path of possibly incorrect decisions or inability to have foresight. So that's the first thing. Make sure your data is not a liability, but is an asset. I think the next thing, we talked a little bit about systems. And I do think it's really important to recognize when you think about a system, to consider the options. And the three options we talked about were buy, build, or retool, and look closely at each one of those. And there's scenarios throughout my career where I've chosen each one of those. And it might not be the right long-term solution in the sense when you begin to think kind of 5 years out, but you're thinking in the next 2 years, that might be the right solution. It might be to retool, not to buy something new. And as we talked about earlier, there was an example that we brought up where I made that decision. It was the right decision for us to retool as opposed to buy new. So take a look at each one of those and think short-term versus long-term. And it's okay to make a decision that's in the short term and then a different decision that's for the long term. And then I think the last one, one of the topics we talked about was culture. And it's just one of those things that's very top of mind for me that I think is really important in recognizing what a good culture means for you as an individual. And it can mean something different for everyone. So as you think about the culture that's being built within the organization, what you're trying to build within your team, just think about what that means for you and the people around you. And again, it's okay if good means something different for everyone, but it's important to, I think, self-reflect on what good means for you. So those are maybe three different pieces of advice that hopefully are useful.
Yeah, really awesome. I love that. I guess maybe just one last question, if I may, Channing, and that is, but going back to the sort of your systems advice on build, buy, or retool. So when many organizations, if they're a 500-person company or a 1,000-person company, or maybe even smaller than that, they're all faced with the same, I think, initial set of questions, which is, who is going to help us make this happen, right? And the who is typically starts with one person, and then that person would potentially need a team, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4 people, to first of all properly make that decision, and then execute or enable or implement that decision. And some of those organizations might have that person already existing in the organization, but in many cases, they don't. And when I say that person, someone who has the experience, who's done it before, and therefore is more likely to make that decision strategically and successfully. What do you think are the skills or the experience that initial person that essentially owns that project, what are the skills and experience that they need to be successful?
So it's always good to get advice. It can't hurt in any case when you're making a decision to try to get advice from people, I believe. And those people can come through internal folks. It could come from external folks as well. So I think as anyone's trying to make a decision around systems and or processes, look at the problem that you're trying to solve, as we talked about earlier. Make sure it's clear with the problem. And then think about what are the ways to solve this. And as you think through that, that's where the advice can come in. It's look to different key stakeholders throughout the business to see what their needs are and their perspective is. If you have third parties that sit outside of the firm, again, reach out to them and begin to talk with them. That may end up being, a vendor that you end up using, or it may end up not being a vendor. But usually people are very willing to give some level of advice. They'll point you in the right direction. And if you do decide to go external, the vendors who I think are probably the best fit are the ones that go down the path of giving you the best advice as well. That's where I would start. I would start internal and then look external for some guidance and advice. And then ultimately making a decision is better than no decision, or no decision is a type of decision, by the way, as well. But I would ensure you're going down a path of making a decision would be the last thing. Because back to your point, Brendan, is how do you ensure success? I think a decision that's well thought out is going to be successful. And often it's not clear that one decision is always that much better than another. But if you've gotten feedback and advice and input, you're going to be able to make that decision a success.
And I guess one of the things that it always leads to when we have these conversations with folks as we're trying to help them, and you mentioned this earlier, that so many of us can get caught up in the shiny object of the technology or the tool. So the sooner we can get to the total cost of ownership, the better. Because it's not just about total cost of ownership, it's total cost of lost revenue, et cetera. So the longer it takes you to figure this out, what is it costing you during the time that you don't have the system and the data correct, right? Are you aware of any sort of tools or frameworks or models that do that calculation to help people to figure out what is it going to cost you the longer it takes you to figure this out?
I like looking at things through that lens. I think it depends on, the scenario, but the total cost of ownership or the total cost of doing something different, what's the cost in this decision versus that decision? Usually you can build up a simple model that can help facilitate that. Or sometimes a vendor, might have a model that can help, facilitate that. I do think, when I sell software, we often will look at it through a cost lens and say, how are we going to find the real value here? Well, what's the cost of the product you have today and the process around that product versus this alternative that I might be trying to take a look at? And we can just look at time spent. We can look at things that go beyond just the cost of the product. I think that's the really important piece. You have a lot of different costs that can go into total cost of ownership. Some of those costs are very clear fixed costs, which are usually software or hardware kind of costs. But then other costs are the people costs and the process cost. And I think you need to look at all those collectively. And again, there's not a model that helps you with this because it depends a little bit on the scenario. But I would ensure you have the people and process costs along with the more fixed costs when you think about that total cost of ownership.
Yeah, I think that was really enlightening when IDC, they've done, I think, the HubSpot ecosystem report now 2 or 3 times. And they always seem to come back with, of every $6 invested in whatever this solution is, only $1 is for the software, and the other $5 or $6 are to actually make it work, which I think is probably another good place to sort of start. Again, we still see a lot where people think that just buying the software is going to be the solution, but of course that happens less today.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, Channing, thanks again so much. Are you in a position to share with us what you're doing next?
Not yet. I've got a couple options that are being weighed right now. So I'll keep you posted.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, like you did the last time. If there's anything we can do, but either way, just let us know where you land.
Yeah, most definitely.
Well, thanks again.
Awesome.
Did you enjoy this episode?
Find more at RevOpsChampions.com.